This video is brought to you by the Logitech Lightspeed Wireless range of keyboards, mice and headsets, the benchmark in wireless gaming performance.
Hello and welcome to another and maybe last Digital Foundry video covering Control Ultimate Edition here on the new current-gen consoles. And today we're going to look more precisely into the performance differences between Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5. And to talk about this, I'm joined by friend, colleague, El Jefe himself, Richard Ledbetter. How you doing there, Rich?
I have no idea what that means, but I guess I'll take it. So this is a really interesting situation here because I think primarily we're going to be looking at ray tracing performance on the consoles, which is a subject that's very close to your heart. But fundamentally, the game locks to 30 frames per second on both of the next-gen systems, and by and large, you get an identical experience in-game. So what we're going to be looking at here is somewhat academic, but it is indicative and quite interesting, I think. So tell us more.
Yeah, basically, just as we're finishing off our coverage here, I was tipped off on Twitter by username Another LED, so thank you very much, that using the photo mode in-game in the quality mode that locks the game usually to 30 FPS, turns off that FPS lock and allows the game to run up to 60 FPS. When you're in photo mode.
Right.
This is interesting because obviously the game in the ray traced quality mode is running a lot heavier than it is in the normal 60 FPS rasterized mode, performance mode. So we get to see the exact differences between the consoles, which are running at parity settings here, 1440p, and see just how much better one, the PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X, is running better than the other. And it's academic for sure, but it's also interesting because we're Digital Foundry. Yeah.
Yes, it is effectively a benchmark, isn't it? But I think we do need to stress that the visual makeup of the game is identical between the two systems, which does make it a benchmark, basically, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, basically, this is something that has been confirmed by Remedy, and the game just looks the exact same. It's perfect benchmarking. And the way I benchmark the game is you are limited obviously to photo mode here, and I wanted to keep myself impartial as much as possible, so I ran through the game at different locations, 25 different ones, went into photo mode, made a recording, and just checked to see that both consoles were running below 60 FPS, because if it's locking to 60 in that moment, that means we're not going to get the pure data there to see what the differences are, because it could be running over 60. In the end, 4 of these samples I had to throw out from 25 because the Xbox Series X was running at 60 there, and in the end I ended up with 21 samples of performance differences.
Wow.
And there's some interesting ones here. I first started with the Corridor of Doom, as always, because I thought it's the heaviest area in the game, and it turned out to be the heaviest area I measured by far. 33 FPS on Xbox Series X, 32 in the exact same view on PlayStation 5. A very low 3% difference in for Xbox Series X's favor here. But this was more rare. Other areas in the game would see, like looking down at the atrium here, around 11% Xbox Series X performance advantage. In maintenance access corridor at the starting elevator area, around a 14% Xbox Series X advantage. The maintenance section foyer thing, and right near BlackRock processing, 20% difference in Xbox Series X favor. And then there's even outliers there, like 36% or so when looking into BlackRock processing. So over these 21 valid samples that I collected, and I could have obviously done more, but there's only so much time I want to invest into this. If someone wanted to, they could. I got an average lead of 16% better performance on Xbox Series X here in quality mode, parity settings, over PlayStation 5. And that's kind of interesting, don't you think?
I think it's fascinating because, I think if I was Microsoft selling Xbox Series X, I'd want to see some sort of return on my silicon investment, because fundamentally the chip within Series X is larger than PlayStation 5. The memory bandwidth is higher. So you'd expect to see some kind of return. Now, it's early days in this generation, and I suspect that developers just want to kind of get their games out of the door. And I think something else which we kind of need to keep in mind is that developers are kind of more interested in people getting the same experience as opposed to, really pushing hardware to the absolute limit. And, there's very good reasons why this mode has a 30 frames per second cap. I think there's more that could be done with it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, it's interesting to actually see a benchmark example that does show that Xbox does have an advantage here. But I do think there are probably a lot of caveats that need to be attached to that. And specifically when you talk about the Corridor of Doom and the fact that it is basically level pegging between the two systems there, this points to a level of variation across the whole experience, where in order to get consistency, Remedy just decided to do a flat 30, and it kind of makes sense.
We've stressed it so often on the channel before that a very wild frame rates below 60 and above 30, it's not very enjoyable on a normal V-synced television display. With variable refresh rate displays, there's some arguments I think to be made around like the 50 FPS mark, or maybe for 120 hertz displays, like a 40 FPS cap, which we've really never seen on console before, but which is doable on PCs. That's actually rather enjoyable from our experience with it. So moving over to the PC side of things, just so the audience here gets an idea of, one, how expensive this game is, and two, just what kind of hardware you need on PC here to get something similar. I was running this test on this, heaviest area here in the Corridor of Doom, by far heaviest area. And I found out that to get above 30 FPS here on the NVIDIA side of things, with no DLSS, as close to console settings as possible, except for the fact that, the resolution of ray tracing is much higher, among other smaller things. But to run that Corridor of Doom at 30 FPS requires a 2070 Super at these higher than PlayStation 5 settings. The AMD side of things, the only GPU I have to cover this is the RX 6800 XT, and in the Corridor of Doom, looking at this one area, I saw around 33 FPS.
Yeah, I think one thing that sticks out to me, though, is that as per your Cold War analysis, the 6800 XT on PC seems to be some way short of expectations compared to what the same RDNA 2 architecture is doing on consoles, with far fewer compute units, far less compute power. So yeah, obviously there is I think twice the resolution in the ray traced reflections here, yes, but I would still expect to see 6800 XT doing much better than 2060 Super, for example. So this is a bit of a mystery here, and I don't know whether it's just early days for DXR on PC and AMD drivers, but maybe there's something more in the tank there based on what we're seeing from the consoles, which have, a lower level API access.
Maybe that's something that we'll see in the future when AMD updates their drivers over time. Another thing to talk about based upon these numbers here is, looking through them all, it's interesting to see how the Xbox is spending a lot of time here in the 50s in my random samples. Obviously, there's no action on screen here usually. And the PlayStation 5 is spending its time in the 40s, more or less. But, what if they dropped the resolution down from 1440p and instead dropped it down to 1080p or so and looked to unlock the frame rate up to 60 FPS? And, looking at these numbers here, I actually think the Xbox Series X, GPU-wise, in most scenarios, could probably be hitting 60 FPS. PlayStation 5, I obviously can't really guess, so much so because I'm not sure how much of a difference 1080p would make, but it's something that they could maybe do as long as the CPU doesn't get in the way, which is something that happens with ray tracing. It's very expensive on the CPU as well, and we don't have any kind of idea here how the console CPUs are handling this game in the ray tracing mode.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, there is some precedent, obviously, with Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered and Miles Morales on PlayStation 5, where they reduced resolution, got frame rate up to 60 frames per second, and retained ray tracing. I think there was a lot more to that than meets the eye, though, based on what you were saying.
Yes.
They reduced the complexity of the BVH structure to reduce the CPU burden. So I think it could work with Control. I'd be really interested to see if they pursue this, because the numbers here do look very, very promising. But, it's potentially quite a lot of development work for what is a relatively small studio.
Yeah, and just to check this out, I did load up one area on the Ryzen 3600, which is my kind of go-to PC CPU, just to see how it compares to the console versions. And I did find that pretty much every area of the game was running above 60 FPS. So maybe this is something that could be looked into over time.
Yeah, but I am fascinated by the whole VRR thing, and also obviously one of the main reasons why we have a 30 frames per second cap is that it's 2 refreshes on a 60 hertz screen, whereas you could have 40 frames per second at 3 refreshes of a 120 hertz screen. And basically there's like a sliding scale of improvement as you improve frame rate. And the leap from 30 to 40 is actually quite profound. So I would like to see perhaps some forward-looking developer maybe look into that. Obviously, very niche audience, but it could be transformative.
I'd like to see that as well, maybe in the future. But Rich, thanks for joining and talking to me today about Control Ultimate Edition and these exact differences between Series X and PlayStation 5.
It's been a pleasure.
Of course. And if you did like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, look at hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to see this video in higher quality, support Digital Foundry on Patreon to get years worth of Digital Foundry content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to Rich or myself about Control Ultimate Edition here on current gen consoles, write a comment below or follow Rich, myself on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex saying Auf Wiedersehen und...
You want me to say something? Finally, a headset that can be as expressive as you. G733 is wireless and designed for comfort, and it's outfitted with all the surround sound, voice filters and advanced lighting you need to look, sound and play with more style than ever. Lightspeed Wireless technology lets you game wirelessly without compromises in latency, connectivity or battery. Play in complete freedom with over 20 hours of battery life and a range of up to 15 meters.